While the Red Wizards of Thay may claim that they invented flying ships powered by a series of enchantments, the truth is that these were a common sight in the fallen, now scattered Empire of Netheril, and the most intact remnant of Netherese culture can be found in the nation of Helruer. Helruan skyships don't use lighter than air gas or heat to provide flotation, they do this with spells. Otherwise, the ship is just a design very similar to the more flexible, clinker-built Carrack, with a more wide-bottomed and sturdy keel for making landings. Although this is largely unnecessary, the closer the enchanted ship comes to the surface, the stronger the repulsion force of its magical levitation becomes. This also drastically limits the sort of cargo and altitude the ship can reach. Slightly larger than the caravel and smaller than the massive top-heavy galleons, sky carracks are typically three-masted with hard duskwood for their masts and keel, flexible overlapping strips of blue leaf timber, and all the smaller fittings and load-bearing parts are either smith metal or rare fanderwood, accented with inlaid brass, gold, and a few parts of dark adamantine. The sails are expertly woven. There is the bowsprit and the mizzen sail. There is the lateen rigged and the square rigged foresail, the mainsail, and the two topsails. The flying ships also have a couple of side panel sails that are kind of lateen rigged. As the predecessor of the galleon, the Carrack is one of the most influential ship designs in Faerun's more recent human-dominated history. While ships became more specialised, the basic design remains unchanged in Thay and Helruer. Both styles are piloted by the use of a silver control rod and two golden sleeves with various runes on them. The position of the golden sleeves on the silver rod controls the levitation and pitch of the ship. They can touch down on the water, but the levitation magic prevents the ship from actually touching down. It just hovers above the surface on its wide hull. I often forget this minor detail and just chalk it up to giving the enchantments a long rest to recharge or some such, but this is just standard dungeon master tactics of never admitting you forgot something and just overlaying more inconsequential details to cover the fact, only for your players to take those details and use them with pinpoint precision to gain an enormous upper hand you never plan for later on in the game. Because the lifting capacity of the ship is limited by its altitude, cargo flights will have a reduced crew, down to as few as 10 to 15 crew, and as long as the altitude doesn't push past a certain point, the ship can carry many tons into the air. It helps to think of the crew members not just as a weight of a person, but more importantly, it's also the weight of their provisions. With a bit of research, it turns out daily rations per person were calculated to be 1.5 pounds of biscuit, half a pound of pork or 1 pound of beef, 2.5 pints of water, 1.25 pints of wine, customary also against scurvy, plus 0.3 gills of vinegar and 0.6 gills of oil. On fasting days, to extend rations and to break up the monotony, meat was substituted by rice, fish, or cheese. Other provisions included flour, lentils, sardines, plums, almonds, garlic, mustard, salt, honey, and sugar. Fresh fish caught on the way, and supplies that are replenished in harbours, including any local fruits and vegetables. So adding it all up, your average 200-pound crew member, being a bit generous, will require 180 pounds or 81 kilograms of provisions per 30 days on board. This also includes their gear. So even with a dangerously minimal crew of 15 on a cargo Carrack on a 3-month trip, that's 8.55 tons, leaving only 1.45 or to 6.545 tons of extra cargo and lift capacity, and only as long as the ship stays within 100 feet of the surface. The levitation strength decreases steadily until the ship can only carry the crew, their provisions, and the ship's bulk up to, at the very most, 3,600 feet. Beyond that range, the ship requires a spelljamming helm device, so nowhere near a match for any modern aircraft's altitude capacity. Looking at the traditional crew requirements of even a cog or a caravel on an ocean sailing vessel, well, it's a lot more than the Dungeon Master's Guide has listed. By a long shot, it's kind of a habit of fantasy RPGs to nerf the crew numbers. A caravel would have 16 officers and 35 sailors with space for a maximum addition of 120 passengers, which makes for a hell of a boarding party if they are all well trained and armed. But again, there is no way to carry the provisions required by that many fighters, so they would require a support ship loaded with provisions and such. A Carrack has a captain, 2 additional command staff, 6 petty officers, specialists like the ship's doctor and the lead carpenter, another 5 special officers, and about 8 ship's mates in charge of the rotating shifts of about 82 sailors, with space for an additional 300 troops. Carracks are about 120 feet long, 100 feet of that is usable deck space, and the ship is about 20 feet wide, which is about 10 feet less than the galleon. The Carrack has a draft of only 11 feet, which is shallow for a ship that weighs around 600 tons, thanks to lightweight woods and flexible construction for the flying Carracks. Wind speed is critical to the velocity of a sailing ship, of course. The Carrack sails at around 7 kilometers per hour under normal wind speeds of 20 to 50 kilometers an hour. Any less than that and its speed drops off dramatically. Any more and it will gain more speed at the cost of taking damage from the strain on the ship itself. I talk about this a bit more later. Complicated rigging makes it easier to steer and limit storm damage, but requires a lot more trained crew. A cargo ship with a reduced crew therefore cannot chance sailing through a storm, as they simply don't have enough crew to handle it without the ship getting mangled. Of course, that is without the assistance of a wizard feeding additional enchantments into the ship, providing more speed, lift, and maneuverability. And since the ships require regular repowering with all sorts of enchantments that keep them flying and flight ready, the ships really need a competent wizard to operate without breaking down pretty quickly. They're also really quite difficult to steer when flying, as the ships are subject to every bit of wind airflow without the friction of having to move through water. This does allow the ship to perform drops and lifts, but really the only combat advantage the ships have is to rain missiles down from high above. Speaking of weapons, these mounted to ships in Faerun are limited. The most advanced are manufactured by the island of Lantern. The most reliable are the traditional weapons mounted to Halruan skyships, and the most formidable are the Thayan fleet. Not quite as formidable as the navy on the Sea of Fallen Stars though. The Karatur nations of Shaolong and Wa have the most impressive and well-known ships, which I will talk about in some detail in another video coming up this month, along with the most famous and well-known port on Toril that people from Toril are never aware of. It's simply called the Dock. Speaking of weapons, let's have a look at the current stats for the kind of weapons you can mount to flying ships. First off, that giant-sized crossbow, the ballista. It's a large object mounted to the ship's deck and can be turned in a firing arc. The weapon itself has an armor class of 15 and around 50 hit points. In experienced hands, it can be operated by one crew member. However, it's much better to have 3 crew, as it takes 1 action to load it, 1 action to aim it, and 1 action to fire it. The extra crew speed that up considerably, as they can combine their actions to get a firing rate of once per round, while one person takes 3 rounds to fire a single shot, or 2 rounds if they're firing without adjusting the aim, which is fine if you're just pounding a huge target that is almost impossible to miss. The ballista has a +6 to hit when aimed and a range of 120 feet, a maximum range, firing with disadvantage, of 480 feet, and it inflicts 3d10 piercing damage with its heavy metal bolts. There is no mention in the Dungeons Master's Guide on page 255 about the fact that ballistae could quickly and fairly easily be adapted by their firing crew to shoot stone balls instead of metal bolts. To make life easy on yourself, just switch the damage type from piercing to bludgeoning, and that's close enough. Damaged ballistae will require a specialist carpenter to repair, but as long as the non-wood parts are not ruined, the whole weapon can be rebuilt by the ship's carpenter over 1 or 2 days just using wood and rope. Next up, we have the manganell. Now, I know this is listed in a lot of ship weapon arrangements, but it's actually not that historically accurate to mount one on a ship, for a couple of good reasons. One, the ammunition and the weapon itself are damned heavy, and the kick of them when they fire can actually damage the ship itself. Second, they're really better suited to being a field battle sort of weapon, and are not as accurate as the ballista. Plus, the firing arc means that they can only be mounted in front of the sails, or you just end up destroying your own rigging. This is not such an issue for spelljamming vessels that don't have the extensive rigging of a sailing ship modified to fly, so I'm just saying that they're unlikely to be used on one of the flying ships. A manganell is a type of traction trebuchet, also called a catapult, and it can hurl rocks, burning objects such as firepots or other containers filled with flammable materials, and pretty much anything else readily available, including bodies. So it's a weapon that can not only be used for destruction, but also to demoralize the enemy and possibly spread disease among them. One other disadvantage is that the manganell can't fire at targets closer than 60 feet. However, it can be pretty devastating against the enemy ship's masts and sails from a pretty good range, even if it is much slower to fire than the ballista. Again, the manganell is a large object, armor class 15 with 100 hit points. It has a +5 to hit targets within 200 feet with a maximum range of 800 feet, inflicting 5d10 bludgeoning damage while firing heavy stone ammunition which sails over in a high arc and lands on top of its target, ignoring cover. It takes 2 actions to load, 2 actions to aim, and 1 action to fire it. It's very important to remember that firing arc and the fact that the missile will come down on top of the target. Finally, we have the cannon. It's a heavy metal tube supported by a platform on little wheels that uses gunpowder to fling heavy balls of cast iron through the air at high velocity. If it's not using gunpowder, it may use smoke powder, in the case of toril, or some arcane power to shoot the cannonball instead. It can also fire cannonballs that are linked together with a heavy chain to rip apart rigging, cut right through a mast, or inflict horrific wounds to the enemy crew. 5th edition gives us a one-size-fits-all stat for the cannon, opting to represent the large cannon. It has an armor class of 19, 75 hit points, and is +6 to hit a target with a range of 600 feet and a maximum range of 2,400 feet, which makes it great for long distance and fairly inaccurate bombardment of a target area. Each shot inflicts 8d10 bludgeoning damage. It's interesting that 5th edition has a quality for monster stat blocks called Siege Monster, where the creature deals double damage to objects and structures, but the actual Siege class weapons in the Dungeon Master's Guide do not have the same quality. Why? Cannons require one action to load, one action to aim, and one action to fire, and are usually operated by a crew of 3. Another option is simply carrying the normal weight of ammunition used in these weapons and just forego the weapon and install ramps on the side of the ship where stones and such can simply be dropped on an enemy target. As flying ships are so rare, combat between 2 flying ships almost never happens on toril anymore, and flying ships mounted weapons are not very effective against flying monsters like dragons and such. Most of the time it's up to the crew to pepper flying creatures with shots from their own ranged weapons, such as crossbows and firearms. Boarding parties can also rappel down ropes pretty quickly, peppering the target below with hand crossbows, magic wands, fairly crude clay flasks of oil or ethanol, lit and exploding on impact in a small conflagration. You wouldn't want to do this in ship-to-ship combat, otherwise everyone is going down in a huge ball of fire, but it's pretty good against infantry and cavalry, particularly devastating against ground-based siege weapons and fortified positions that don't have their own cannons or ballistae. A lightly crewed airship loaded with a moderate amount of oil barrels can stay out of the 500-foot range of your average ballista. A manganell can't hit anything past 800 feet, so the airship can simply try to make a lot of tight turns and stay over a target, hammering it with stone and fire from 1,000 feet in the air. We have a standard stat block for the 3-mast Carrack sailing ship. In 5th edition, it's a much simplified version from earlier editions. I'm going to list those stats down below in the video description, particularly in regard to how sailing speed is listed. It's very simplified. It gives an armor class of 12 to the sails, 100 hit points, and for each 25 damage the sail takes, the speed of the ship is reduced by 5 feet. Now, there's a lot of sails on a Carrack, so it's probably easier just to say each one of the 3 masts and their riggings and sails is represented by that armor class and hit point total. So a sailing ship in normal light breeze conditions can travel 45 feet per round in the water, reduced to 15 feet per round when sailing into the wind, and increasing to 60 feet per round when sailing with the wind. In heavy wind conditions, such as a storm at sea, the ship can travel faster downwind, 80 feet per round or so, but will take damage to the masts, rigging, and sails that quickly starts to reduce ship speed. So it's better to lash the sails and simply ride out a storm rather than trying to race through it. Again, I have to point out that Wizards of the Coast is allergic to both realistic and accurate numbers for the crew on board the ship and for the general tonnage of the cargo and the ship itself. In fact, there is no information on how much the ship weighs. You would have to do a little Googling to find that information, or just go back in this video where I tell you exactly how much it weighs. But thankfully, the internet is loaded with information on the age of sails and all manner of sailing ships. The history of sailing ships and siege weapons makes for fascinating reading, as does the history of firearms, which I will be covering for you very soon, but not real-world history of them, just their use in fantasy worlds. So, lots more coming, but for now, thank you very much for listening, and as always, I'll be back with more for you very soon.